Across decades of conflict, the US Navy has proven time and time again that they're the force to be reckoned with in the waves of war. From the cold waters of Korea to Vietnam and into the far reaches of the Persian Gulf, naval warships and submarines have played a crucial role in every major conflict. But haven't you ever wondered how they were so successful regardless of the terrain? Ladies and gentlemen, put on your sailing shoes as we go through the legendary tales of how the US Navy's power and stealth shaped the outcome of war across the globe. Although the Korean War was initially between South Korea and North Korea, it saw the involvement of other nations like the Soviet Union and China, who supported North Korea, while the US supported South Korea. Of all the nations that got involved, though, the US played a significant role, thanks to their advanced naval forces at the time. What US Navy warships made this possible? Stay with us to find out. The Korean War broke out in 1950 and lasted till 1953, with an armistice between both nations. However, all through the war, the United States had allied with South Korea as part of the United Nations Congress. By this time, the US Navy had sufficient experience and ammunition, having fought in the First and Second World Wars. They deployed hundreds of warships during this war, so we'll have to focus on the most important and active ones during this war. Starting with the Fletcher-class destroyers. This class consists of 175 ships, all built between 1941 and 1945. As a result, they served during World War II, being deployed exclusively in the Pacific Theater of Operations, where they accounted for the sinking of 29 Imperial Japanese Navy submarines. After the war, with 19 lost and 6 severely damaged, the Fletchers were decommissioned and put into reserve until the outbreak of the Korean War. As soon as the war broke out, the US Navy brought these destroyers back into active duty, refitting about 39 of them under Project SCB-74A, which was aimed at reducing the overall main armament of these destroyers. This project also meant that the number of torpedo tubes was reduced, all in an effort to accommodate other weapons. One of these weapons was the Weapon Alpha, which was a naval head-throwing anti-submarine rocket launcher that had been designed just a couple of years earlier. Some of the other Fletcher-class destroyers were refitted to carry a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon called trainable Hedgehogs. These upgrades proved really useful, and the Fletchers were able to play major roles in ensuring South Korea wasn't overcome during the war. The likes of the lead ship, USS Fletcher, provided gunfire support during the war, while destroyers like O'Bannon served as flagships for other battalions, firing on enemy gun emplacements and protecting convoys. They also served as screening carriers and patrol vessels off Korea and Taiwan. While these ships get a lot of credit for their outstanding service during the Second World War and the Korean War, it's important to acknowledge the designers of the class. Back in 1939, the US requested for the design of a class of destroyers which didn't have the flaws of the earlier destroyer leader types, of the Porter and Somers classes. The result was the Fletcher class, which was larger than the earlier designs with improved defensive capacity, like the addition of 2 40mm Bofors quadruple mount and 6 20mm Oerlikon dual anti-aircraft guns. They were also much less top-heavy than their predecessors, which made room for additional equipment at any time without requiring major redesigns. These ships could achieve 38 knots thanks to their air-encased steam-producing boilers, 2 350-kilowatt steam turbine-driven electrical generators, and a 100-kilowatt emergency diesel generator. Before the addition of the Weapon Alpha and Hedgehogs, the main armament of this class of destroyers was 5 dual-purpose 5-inch 38-caliber guns in single Mk-30 turrets. This was guided by a Mark 37 gunfire control system that included an Mk-12 fire control radar and an Mk-22 height finder linked by a Mark 1A fire control computer and stabilized by a Mark 6 8,500 RPM gyroscope. They also had 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, fitted in 2 quintuple mounts amidships, which fit the 21-inch Mark 15 torpedo. They also had the aforementioned anti-aircraft weaponry, which could later be augmented with the removal of the forward set of torpedo tubes to make room for the replacement of 2 amidships with twin 40mm guns with 2 quadruple mountings, making a total of 14. Fletchers were also upgraded to carry 6 twin gun mounts instead of their 7 single 20mm guns. Moving on to the next ships used by the US Navy in the Second World War are the Iowa-class battleships. Like the Fletcher-class ships, the Iowa were commissioned early enough to serve in World War II, although the Iowas only served during the later years of the war. This class of battleships were designed mainly for speed against fast capital ships such as Japanese Kongo-class during the World War, although they later proved useful for so much more in the decades that followed after the war. The 6 ships in this class were designed to have a full load displacement of 57,540 long tons, having a double bottom hull that changes to a triple bottom under the armored citadel, and armored skegs surrounding the inboard shafts. They also featured 8 boilers and 4 sets of double reduction cross-compound geared turbines to provide electricity. Each of the turbine sets drove a single shaft that the ship's total machinery spaces were split into 8 divisions with alternating fire and engine rooms. Iowas also had both high and low pressure turbines in their double expansion engines and were outfitted with 4 screws and 2 inner shafts housed in skegs to smooth the flow of water to the propellers and improve the stern's structural strength. Although the Iowas were initially fitted with SK air search radar and SG surface search radar, they later received upgrades like the SK2 air search radar and the installation of the SP height finder on the main mast. During the heat of the Korean War, these ships received the addition of the more advanced AN-SPS-10 surface search radar and AN-SPS-6 air search radar. This period also saw the addition of the Mark 13 and Mark 25 fire control radars to the Iowa class, making them more efficient. With the Iowa-class battleships having very good stability, they were able to carry a lot of guns for their main battery. This included 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 naval guns, which fired high explosive and armor-piercing shells, with a maximum firing rate of 2 rounds per minute. By the 1950s, these guns had been developed to become the world's largest nuclear artillery, thanks to the adaptation of the W-19 nuclear artillery shell. The Iowas also carried 25-inch 38-caliber Mark 12 guns in 10 Mark 28 Mod 2 enclosed base ring mounts, 80 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and 49 20mm anti-aircraft guns. They had armor protection against shell fire and bombs, with significant underwater protection against torpedoes, with heavily protected main battery turrets. By the time they were commissioned in the 1940s, the Iowa-class battleships had 2 aircraft catapults designed to launch float planes. However, a decade later, during the Korean War, helicopters had replaced float planes, so the ships made use of the Sikorsky HO-3S-1 helicopter instead. We should point out that of the 6 ships in this class, only 4 were able to serve during the Korean War. The class's lead ship, Iowa, was deployed to bombard enemy targets at Songjin, Hyungnam, and Kojo, North Korea, after which she was returned to the US and decommissioned for a couple of decades. USS New Jersey pounded targets at Wonsan, Yangyang, and Kansong, and Wisconsin served 2 tours of duty during the war, assisting South Korea and UN forces by making available call fire support and shelling targets. The youngest ship of the class, Missouri, only served at the end of World War II, so she was able to have more outings during the Korean War, dispatched to the front line in Korea to provide shore bombardment. Next, we'll be taking a look at the Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, which were some of the most lethal and effective ships during the Korean War. This class of 14 heavy cruisers were the first cruisers in the US Navy to be designed without the limitations of the London Naval Treaty, making them more lethal than most of the other cruisers during this era. Of the 14 in the class, only the USS Baltimore, USS Bremerton, USS Helena, USS Los Angeles, USS Pittsburgh, USS Quincy, USS Rochester, USS St. Paul, and USS Toledo served extensively in the Korean War. They were all fast and heavily armored, hence they were deployed to protect the fast aircraft carriers and battle groups from air attack. Some were used for escort missions and coastal bombardment in Korea, while others served as reinforcement fleets in other allied areas of the world during the war. The Baltimore-class cruisers were the same size as the previous Albany and Boston classes, but differed in other aspects. The superstructure of these ships occupied 1/3 of the ship's length and had the 2 funnels instead of the combined 1 thicker funnel of the previous classes. These ships ran on steam power, each having 4 shafts, each with a propeller, shafts turned by 4 steam turbines, and 2 engine rooms. They had way better displacement than their predecessors and could carry up to 2,250 long tons of fuel, putting the maximum range at a cruising speed of 28 kilometers per hour at about 10,000 nautical miles. For the main armament, the Baltimore class had 3 separate turrets, each with 3 Mark 15 8-inch 55 caliber guns. These guns fired a 335-pound shell out to a maximum range of 30,050 yards, and had armor-piercing shells which could penetrate 6 inches of armor plating at 20,800 yards. These cruisers also had 12 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 6 twin mounts, 2 of which were located on each side of the superstructure, while the other 2 were behind the main batteries, fore and aft. Although the 38 caliber guns could be used against aircraft targets, the Baltimore still had a special light anti-aircraft armament, which included 12 quadruple mounts of Bofors 40mm guns, or 11 quadruple mounts and 2 twin mounts on ships with only 1 rear aircraft crane. For sensor electronics and radar systems, the Baltimores made use of the SPS-6 combined with an SPS-8 as a height finder during the Korean War. Although these systems were upgraded after the war, they were definitely effective enough to do the job during the war. And there's more. Ships in this class also carried 2 aircraft catapults on the side edges of the aft deck, between which was the roof of an onboard hangar that could accommodate up to 4 aircraft at one time. The hull design of this class would later be used for the development of several other classes of US Navy cruisers, like the Oregon City class, the Des Moines class, and the Sapien class. Lastly, there are the Allen M. Sumner class destroyers, a class of 58 destroyers all built during World War II. It's fair to say that a considerable percentage of warcraft deployed by the US Navy during the Korean War were from this class. USS Blue, USS Bory, USS Bristol, USS Buck, USS O'Brien, USS Laffey, USS Walk, and USS Strong are just a few of the battleships in this class that had outstanding service during the war. Honorable mention, however, goes to the likes of USS Barton, which served in the Korean War as part of the Joint Task Force 77, working as part of a hunter-killer group for operations along the east coast of Korea, and eventually got hit on her #1 stack by a 4-inch shell from an enemy shore battery. Another is USS De Haven, which was assigned to patrol off the Korean coast, where she served a variety of purposes, from screening ships that evacuated American dependents from Incheon to Yokosuka, to patrolling on blockades, bombarding shore targets, acting as lifeguard in communications, linking ship for airstrikes, and providing call fire support for United Nations troops. De Haven was so successful in her outings that she was awarded the Navy Unit Commendation for her first tour in the Korean War. Another Allen M. Sumner class destroyer, USS Maddox, had similar experience, acting as plane guard and anti-submarine screen for aircraft carriers, carrying out coastal blockade and bombardment duties, and taking part in the siege of Wonsan in April 1952. Generally, the Sumner-class ships were an improvement of the Fletcher class, having 3 twin 5-inch 38 caliber gun mounts replace the Fletcher's 5 single mounts, and new twin rudders for better maneuverability for the ASW work. They had their 5-inch guns guided by a Mark 37 gunfire control system, with a Mark 25 fire control radar linked by a Mark 1A fire control computer, stabilized by a Mark 6 8,500 RPM gyro to protect effective long-range anti-aircraft or anti-surface fire. They also had separate short-range anti-aircraft armament that included 12 40mm guns and 11 20mm guns. They also carried 6 3-inch 50 caliber guns, and by the Korean War, they were fitted with the 2 Hedgehog ASW weapons, 1 depth charge rack, and 6 K-gun depth charge throwers. Beneath the waves, US Navy submarines in the Korean conflict. Seeing as the Korean War was a civil war, people tend to forget how important a role the US Navy and its submarines played in helping South Korea stand its ground during the war. In this video, we'll be taking you through the lethal underwater crafts deployed by the US Navy during the Korean conflict. Make sure you stick around so you don't miss out on anything. The Korean War started in 1950 and ended 3 years later when North Korea and South Korea were able to come to an armistice. For the most part of the war, a couple of other nations allied with both countries. North Korea was backed by the Soviet Union and China, while South Korea had the entire United Nations command, which was led by the United States behind them. However, as much as the US was involved in the war, you have to keep in mind that the Korean War was a civil war. The majority of the battles and attacks didn't exceed the Asian hemisphere, and as a result, the US Navy didn't have as much to do as they did during World War II, which ended just a few years earlier. So when it came to deploying submarines to get involved in the war, the Navy only ever needed two classes of battle submarines, namely the Trench-class submarines and the Baleo-class submarines. Starting with the Tench-class submarines, of which only a handful were deployed during the Korean War. The United Navy initially launched construction on these vessels in 1944 during World War II. However, after 29 of the proposed 80 submarines in this class had been completed, construction was put on hold as the Navy realized more Tenches wouldn't be needed to accomplish their primary purpose of defeating Japan. Little did they know that less than a decade later, the Navy would be requiring these boats to serve in the Korean War. By 1950, when the war broke out, the Tenches were the first set of submarines to be deployed to join the war. Before this time, though, the US submarine force had launched the Guppy Initiative, which was a conversion program developed to give some of the Baleo and Tench-class submarines similar capabilities to the German Type 21 U-boat. This was because after the war, recently designed submarines like the Tenches quickly became obsolete. They were designed to combat quick Japanese fleet boats during the war, an objective that had been achieved less than a year after the class was commissioned. In the years that followed, the Guppy program sought to make improvements to these submarines. The Guppy program sought to make improvements to make these submarines have larger battery capacity and better streamlining for maximum underwater speed, as these were the requirements to match the capabilities of enemy submarines post-World War II. A total of 16 Tench-class submarines were converted to one of the Guppy configurations, while 8 got the fleet snorkel modifications. Originally, the Tench-class submarines were designed to have 4 diesel engines driving electrical generators, 2 126-cell Sargo batteries, 2 low-speed directive drive electric motors, and 2 propellers. Their armament featured 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 28 torpedoes, 1 5-inch 25 caliber deck gun, and 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The original Tenches also had a top speed of 38 km per hour on the surface, 16 km per hour submerged, a range of 11,000 nautical miles, and a complement of 10 officers and 71 enlisted. By the Korean War, these submarines had undergone the Guppy conversion programs, and some of the major improvements included the replacement of 2 Sargo batteries with 4 more compact Guppy or Sargo II batteries, the removal of the auxiliary diesels, and the reutilization of below-deck space. Every Tench-class Guppy model submarine also had a snorkel, way more streamlined sail and bow, sonar, fire control, and electronic support measures upgrades. Their electric motor engines were also upgraded to the direct drive double armature type, which enabled the addition of modernized electrical and air conditioning systems. Virtually all the Tench-class submarines that served during the Korean War had the Guppy II modifications, which featured 3 new masts, snorkel induction, snorkel exhaust, and ESM mast. They also had the recently perfected snorkel design, and their high-speed drive motors were replaced with low-speed direct drive motors, producing 2,500 horsepower per shaft. One of these submarines was the USS Remora, which was already conducting anti-submarine warfare training exercises with units of naval forces far east in Yokosuka before the war began. As soon as the Korean War began, Remora was deployed to serve with the naval forces Japan, patrolling Soya Strait between Hokkaido and Sakhalin. She'd later returned to San Diego for overhaul before going back to the Western Pacific, where she served for the remainder of the war, patrolling the Okinawan waters. Another Tench-class submarine, the USS Valador, arrived in Yokosuka in 1951, where she carried out a number of special operations, like conducting undetected reconnaissance patrol in Japan to keep the Navy informed of China's seaborne and airborne activity. Valador also carried out anti-submarine warfare operations with US Navy destroyers and is considered one of the most effective submarines to have served during the Korean War. Other subs in the Tench class that served in the war include USS Pomadon and USS Pickerel. By the end of the war, less than 10 Tench-class submarines were deployed for service, leaving the bulk of the underwater duties to the Baleo-class submarines. This might come as a surprise, seeing that the Baleo class are the predecessors of the Tench class. However, the major reason why so many Baleos were used in the Korean War is the fact that this class was, and still is, the largest class of submarines in the United States Navy, with 120 boats completed in this class. The original Baleo-class submarines were designed as an improvement on the early Ogato class during World War II. They were made to be significantly thicker, thanks to the use of new high-tensile steel alloy combined with an increased hull thickness, and have way higher yield strength steel in the pressure hull skins and frames than all the submarines made before them. These vessels had the diesel-electric engines, which was customary at the time, and incorporated the Fairwater design with a reduction in the conning tower and periscope shear sizes. Like the original Tench-class subs, vessels in the Baleo class also ran on 4 engines, had 2 Sargo batteries, 4 high-speed electric motors with reduction gears, and 2 shafts. They also had the same top speed, same range, and same endurance hours as the Tench-class submarines would have. The armament for these boats included 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 24 torpedoes, and 1 5-inch 25 caliber deck gun. During World War II, many of the Baleo-class submarines were deployed to serve in the Pacific, where there was hardly any use of a torpedo when the targets were sampans. As a result, lethal deck guns were important additions to these boats. Earlier models had 4-inch 50 caliber Mark 9 guns, which were later replaced with 5-inch 25 caliber Mark 17 guns. These guns were very much alike to the typical mounts seen on battleships and cruisers. Only the Mark 17s were built with corrosion-resistant materials and power-operated loading, without aiming features. Commonly used anti-aircraft guns like the single 40mm Bofors and twin 20mm Oerlikon mounts were also added later on. The Baleo-class submarines also had a design that allowed the substitution of mines for torpedoes, with the use of Mark 10 and Mark 12 type mines. This technology was introduced in the Tambor and Gatto classes that preceded these subs and was maintained even when the Guppy conversions were made. For more efficiency though, the Mark 49 mine replaced the Mark 12s, and the larger Mark 28 mines were introduced with the constraint of only allowing 1 mine replacing 1 torpedo. By 1950, when the Korean War began, all surviving 101 Baleo-class submarines had been modified under the Guppy configuration. 13 of them had the Guppy 2 conversions, 9 had the Guppy 1A conversions, nearly 24 had the fleet snorkel upgrades, and the others fell into the Guppy 1B or Guppy 3 conversions. One of the only 2 subs in the Baleo class to be converted to transport submarines was the USS Perch, which received a War Patrol Combat Pin for carrying the British Royal Marines on a strike on a North Korean railroad in September 1950. Fun fact: Perch's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander R.D. Quinn, is the only submarine commanding officer to receive a combat award during the Korean conflict, despite the sub having just 1 patrol. Another Baleo-class submarine that served in the Korean War was the USS Blenny, which was converted in 1951 to the more cost-effective Guppy 1A model. Before the war, Blenny was either a midshipman cruise in Canada or Alaska. When the war broke out, however, she was deployed to Pearl Harbor, where she joined the fleet maneuvers off Hawaii. After her conversion, she was redeployed to serve across the Pacific for a cruise in the Far East, arriving in Yokosuka, Japan. While there, Blenny took part in many routine United States 7th Fleet operations, and made a 35-day reconnaissance war patrol off the Korean peninsula during the Korean War. Her sister submarine, USS Teru, saw a lot more action in the war despite also being returned to San Diego for a while to undergo an upgrade to the Guppy 2 model. Teru was fresh off conducting training and trials off the West Coast when the Korean War started. In June 1951, she sailed for the Far East and her first Western Pacific deployment, where she served as part of the United Nations forces. She also provided services for anti-submarine warfare exercises during the years during which the Korean War lasted. We also have to mention the USS Basugo, another Baleo-class submarine that took part in the war, both before and after getting fleet snorkel upgrades. Basugo left Pearl Harbor for Yokosuka in October 1959, and spent her first month in Japan training and being used in target services for U.S. anti-submarine warfare planes and warships. Eventually, in December 1950, she took up a patrol station off La Perouse Strait north of Hokkaido. During this period, Basugo bravely wandered through rough seas and a succession of snowstorms, as she made reconnaissance of Soviet ships moving between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Sea of Japan. She was also used to carrying out rescue operations, such as the rescue of 6 survivors of a PBM Mariner flying boat that had crashed in Nezuko on Omami-Oshima after the installment of new sonar equipment and mine-clearing capability in 1951. Basugo returned to serve in the war. This time stationed at Subic Bay in the Philippines. She again conducted photographic reconnaissance of Hainan Island while submerged. Unfortunately, not only was the weather at her station terrible, her crew also had many disturbances from fishing sampans, resulting in her mission yielding very little results. The list of US submarines used in the Korean War won't be complete without mentioning yet another Baleo-class submarine, one known as the Sea Devil. This submarine was one of the best in her class during the Second World War, having successfully completed 5 war patrols, including sinking Akikawa Maru and Hawaii Maru, and earning 5 battle stars. She continued to offer anti-submarine warfare training after the war until she was decommissioned in 1948. But just 2 months after the outbreak of hostilities in Korea, Sea Devil was ordered back into action, assigned to Subdiv 71, Subron 7, and based at Pearl Harbor. Given her stellar World War II experience in navigating Asian seas, it's no surprise she was recommissioned. Having only been used in Hawaiian waters for the early years of the war, Sea Devil was sent to the Western Pacific in September 1952. Serving from Yokosuka, she served TF-96, conducting ASW training exercises and maintaining preparedness for hunter-killer operations in support of the United Nations efforts until the end of the war. Other Baleo-class submarines that served in the Korean War include USS Bugara, USS Carp, USS Char, USS Greenfish, USS Menhaden, USS Pomfret, USS Redfish, USS Scabberdash, and USS Segundo. 1955 to 1975. 20 long years. The Vietnam War was one of the most complex and contentious conflicts in modern history. It was a struggle not just of armies, but ideologies and nations. From daunting airstrikes to conducting covert riverine operations, history paints the US Navy's involvement as a decisive affair. But was that actually the case? Today we'll be peeling back the layers and dividing it into the incredible stories of the naval ships that sailed to the heart of the conflict. We'll go over their interesting designs, cool weapons, dangerous missions, and all of their flaws to uncover the untold tales of naval heroism and innovation that helped shape the course of the Vietnam War. Make no mistake, sailing on a Navy ship during this perilous time was by no means easy. It was dangerous. It was intense. It was challenging. The sailors? Total war heroes. They had to face frequent combat, especially those on aircraft carriers, riverine patrol boats, and destroyers. These vessels also took part in all kinds of operations, such as search and rescue missions, supporting ground troops, and naval bombardment. Worse yet, the sailors in question were not even shielded from combat. The vessels were frequently deployed near the Vietnamese coast, making them susceptible to enemy attacks at any time. The majority of sailors were forced to witness war directly, along with its excruciating risk and stress. And if living on board a ship wasn't already depressing enough, there was also the constant fear of enemy fire, which made life even more tense and nauseating. Without further ado, let's start off with the aircraft carriers. During the 2-decade war, the United States Navy aircraft carriers were crucial in many military operations. And no, they weren't just for transporting planes such as the F-4 Phantom and A-1 Skyraider, as their name suggests. They also provided close air support for ground troops, served as platforms for airstrikes, and conducted reconnaissance missions. And don't even get me started on carriers like the Douglas Sky Warrior, equipped with electronic countermeasure equipment. It was deployed to disrupt North Vietnamese defenses, jam enemy radar and communications, and protect US aircraft from surface-to-air missiles, ASMs. But among the scores of carriers deployed in the war, one that really stood out the most was the USS Enterprise, CNV-65. That was deeply involved in air operations and served as a launch platform for various combat aircraft. Its operational prowess was also demonstrated during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it was rapidly deployed to enforce a naval quarantine around Cuba. Renowned for being the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise was commissioned in 1961. It was designed to protect American power worldwide, with its nuclear propulsion allowing it to operate without refueling for extended periods. Cool, right? We've barely touched the surface. Built by Newport News Shipbuilding, the USS Enterprise used 60,923 tons of steel, 1,507 tons of aluminum, 230 miles of pipe and tubing, and 1,700 tons of welding rods. It featured a unique 8-reactor propulsion system, making it the only carrier with more than 2 reactors. This gave the Enterprise exceptional operational endurance. Additionally, the steel provided the necessary strength to endure combat conditions, while the aluminum helped reduce the speed's overall weight. What about the hull? Modified from the Fortis Steel class design with the inclusion of a more cruiser-like structure, the Enterprise also had enhanced speed and maneuverability. Measuring 1,123 feet in length, the USS Enterprise was the longest carrier in the US Navy. It had a waterline beam of 132.8 feet, a draft of 39 feet, and a displacement of 94,781 tons. The flight deck covered 4.47 acres, with a width of 252 feet, while the hangar bay spanned 5 acres. So with all of that in mind, it's easy to say the Enterprise's design focused on speed, robustness, and versatility to both launch and recover aircraft efficiently. The fact that it also had a nuclear propulsion system that allowed extensive deployments without need for refueling was yet another boost. Plus, there was no slouch in the armament department. At first, the USS Enterprise had limited defense weaponry due to its high construction costs. However, over time, it was equipped with various weapon systems, including NATO Sea Sparrow missile launchers and Phalanx CIWS mounts for close-in defense against missile and aircraft. It also featured advanced radar systems, such as the AN-SPS-32 and the AN-SPS-33, which enhanced its capability to track multiple airborne targets. Alas, the design, for all its charm, also had its drawbacks. To start with, the complexity of its 8-reactor system required extensive maintenance and was a significant power drain on the ship's electrical systems. And don't even get me started on how high the construction and operational costs sadly led to the cancellation of additional ships in this class. So you see, while the USS Enterprise CNV-65 was a groundbreaking naval vessel that significantly influenced naval operations thanks to its advanced design and nuclear propulsion, it came at a high financial and maintenance cost, the latter of which finally led to its eventual cancellation. Moving on, can we all agree that in the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin became a critical battleground? There, US naval ships played a multitude of roles, including supporting ground operations and maintaining naval superiority. On the gun line of the Gulf of Tonkin, destroyers and destroyer escorts were frequently stationed to provide essential fire support for ground troops. These ships were tasked with bombarding enemy positions, often guided by target information relayed from ground forces or spotter planes. They would unleash their firepower on designated targets, aiming to disrupt and destroy North Vietnamese military operations, and also protect the fleet from airborne threats with their advanced missile systems. Nighttime on the waterfront can get pretty scary, even more so on the seas. Given that operations needed light, sailors often required the firing of illumination rounds, lighting up the night sky to reveal enemy positions. These rounds not only helped in identifying targets, but also served to harass North Vietnamese forces, depriving them of rest and creating a constant state of vigilance. Why, you might ask? Well, it all boils down to psychology. Just imagine the sounds of hundreds of shots piercing your ears in the middle of the night. The continuous bombardment and the threat of sudden attacks wear down the enemy's morale and capabilities. But don't take this to mean smooth sailing for the US Navy. The ships on the gun line frequently changed locations to avoid becoming easy targets for North Vietnamese coastal defenses. Missions like the Linebacker night strikes brought US ships perilously close to the coast, making them vulnerable to retaliatory fire from coastal gun emplacements. These missions were extremely hazardous, with ships often coming under heavy fire. Near misses were common, and some ships were hit, resulting in damage, injuries, and casualties among the crew. However, despite the dangers, the relentless efforts of these naval vessels were crucial in supporting the military objectives in Vietnam during one of the most challenging conflicts in modern history. Take, for instance, the USS Maddox, DD-731, commissioned on June 2, 1944, as an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer. The Maddox initially served in World War II, where it received 4 battle stars, and in the Korean War, where it got 6, long before its notable involvement in the Vietnam War. But primarily from high-tensile steel, the compact and streamlined design of the USS Maddox allowed for quick movement and rapid response to threats. And being smaller than the aircraft carriers, the destroyer had the advantage of being less detectable and being more agile in all kinds of combat scenarios. Featuring a design optimized for anti-submarine warfare and high-speed maneuvers, its robust structure crafted from steel allowed it to endure significant damage, but nothing too crazy. It was a ship after all. Armament-wise, though, the Maddox was impressive. It was armed with a range of offensive and defensive weapons, including 5-inch 38 caliber guns that were effective for surface targets and shore bombardments, and 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns, serving defense against aerial threats. It even had torpedoes and depth charges for anti-submarine warfare. In fact, on August 2nd in the Persian Gulf, while sailing in international waters, the Maddox was attacked by 3 North Vietnamese motor torpedo boats. During the engagement, the Maddox dodged the torpedoes and disabled 2 of the boats with direct hits. The Maddox's impressive feat ensured no American crew members were killed or injured. One of the most significant advantages of the Maddox was its durability. The ship's robust design enabled it to withstand considerable damage, making it a reliable asset in hostile environments. Take, for instance, the Persian Gulf incident on August 2nd. It didn't even sustain any significant damage. Its amazing durability was a testament to the solid engineering practices of the era, ensuring that the vessel could sustain and continue operations even after taking hits. Additionally, the Maddox was highly versatile. It was equipped for multiple roles, including anti-submarine and anti-aircraft warfare, like we talked about earlier, which allowed it to adapt to various combat scenarios. This versatility was crucial in the dynamic and often unpredictable theater of the Vietnam War, where the ability to switch between different operational roles often made a world of difference in mission successes. Whether it was engaging in underwater or aerial threats, the Maddox was a formidable presence on the battlefield. Finally, another major pro was the ship's speed and maneuverability. You see, the Maddox was capable of high-speed operations, which were essential for both evasion and engagement. Its engineered ability to move swiftly and maneuver effectively ensured the Maddox could keep pace with faster, more agile vessels and evade enemy attacks when necessary. However, despite these advantages, the Maddox, albeit subjective, had its fair share of drawbacks. Most notably, by the time of the Vietnam War, some of its systems were considered outdated compared to newer vessels. The rapid advancement of naval technology meant that certain aspects of the Maddox design, while state-of-the-art at the time of its construction, had become less effective. This aging technology posed a challenge as the ship's older systems struggled to keep up with the demands of modern warfare. Furthermore, while the ship was sturdy, it was not always robust enough to handle the sophisticated armaments deployed by the North Vietnamese. This vulnerability highlighted a significant con in its design, as it required constant updates and adaptations to maintain its defensive capabilities. Okay, so we've talked about a heavy-hitting destroyer and, ideally, one of the most significant carriers in the war. But was there any other vessel class that helped the Navy perform to the best of its ability? Well, to put it simply, the answer is yes. Patrol boats, most especially the Patrol Craft Fast, PCF, or Swift boats, if you may, were essential components of the US Navy during the Vietnam War. Constructed by Seaward Seacraft, and later by other boat builders following Navy specifications, they were designed to navigate the shallow and narrow waterways of Vietnam, providing flexibility and speed in challenging environments. But while the main mission objective of the Swift boats was to provide the Navy with a fast boat that could patrol many miles of the river shores, it all started when Seaward Seacraft of Berwick, Louisiana, initially known for building water taxis for companies operating oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, deployed the Swift boats. Recognizing the suitability of these vessels for military use, the US Navy acquired the designs from Seaward Seacraft and commissioned the company to create modified drawings. These enhancements included the addition of a gun tub, ammo lockers, bunkers, and a small galley to adapt the water taxis for combat situations. With these enhanced plans, the Navy sought bids from various boat builders before ultimately choosing Seaward Seacraft to construct the boats. The resulting Swift boats were shallow draft vessels made of aluminum. Initially, their primary role was to patrol coastal areas, but as the Vietnam War progressed, they became an integral part of the Brown Water Navy. They intercepted Viet Cong movements of arms and munitions, transported South Vietnamese forces, and inserted SEAL teams for counterinsurgency, COIN operations. But if there's one thing to love about the vessel, It has to be the fact that their shallow draft allowed them to navigate the intricate river systems of Vietnam effectively, thus making them invaluable for operations of the Mekong Delta and other riverine environments. This was what crowned the Navy's efforts to control the waterways and support ground operations during the Vietnam War. Measuring 50 feet in length, with a 13-foot beam, Swift boats were made primarily of aluminum, a choice driven by the need for lightweight yet durable construction. Speaking of the former, the lightweight nature of aluminum was crucial for achieving high speeds in shallow and narrow waterways, and given how aluminum also provided resistance to corrosion, it was perfect for handling the humid, saltwater conditions of Vietnam. But before we go into its armaments, you might want to jot down the points of aluminum, because spoiler alert, it did have its shortcomings. A pretty major one. Okay, so the armaments of the Swift boats were tailored for versatility and effectiveness in both offense and defensive operations, right? They typically featured twin 50 caliber machine guns mounted in a turret above the pilot house, and an 81mm mortar combined with another 50 caliber machine gun on the rear deck. Additionally, some were also equipped with M60 machine guns positioned at the bow. This neat configuration allowed the PCFs to engage enemy forces effectively while providing suppressive fire during troop insertions and extractions. So yeah, it was pretty handy. The Swift boats, as their name implies, performed admirably under the demanding conditions of the Vietnam War. They were rapid, and the added maneuverability features gave them some unique advantages. Not a lot of vessels at the time could both engage and disengage quickly from hostile encounters. It was usually one for the other, or none at all. But hey, remember when I told you to keep its aluminum construction in mind? Well guys, while the PCF's aluminum hulls were durable, they offered extremely limited protection against heavy gunfire and rocket-propelled grenades. Plus, you'd be hard-pressed to say the boat's relatively small size didn't restrict the number of personnel and the amount of equipment they could transport, which sometimes limited their operational effectiveness. Overall, being on a Navy ship during the Vietnam War must have been a complex and demanding experience. While the US Navy's ships during the Vietnam War were marvels of engineering designed to meet the most diverse and demanding challenges of the conflict, the sailors were certainly exposed to the harsh realities of combat. From the gargantuan aircraft carriers to the portable patrol boats, each vessel used by the Navy was pivotal to the overall objectives. But just as their design, construction, and armor birthed a multitude of pros, so did they showcase nail-biting limitations. And that, folks, is why if you want to get a taste of fascinating history of military operations and the incredible machines that make them possible, then this is the best place to be. Submarines. The quintessential unsung hero of the US Navy's key involvement in the Vietnam War. More than just stealthy vessels for clandestine affairs, these underwater vessels tipped the scales time without number. But aren't you curious as to how these submarines were so effective, so elusive, and so deadly? In the dark and lurking depths, how did these submerged crusaders stay one step ahead of their adversaries while remaining shrouded in mystery? The burning answers lie here, all in today's video. Sometimes it hurts that submarines thrive on their invisibility. Unlike surface vessels that sailed the seas, submarines operated in a treacherous environment shrouded in secrecy, darkness, and death-like silence. As unsung war heroes that never take due credit, they prowl the depths to gather intelligence, deploy special forces, and sometimes launch surprise attacks. Strategies all used by the US Navy in Vietnam. Were they perfect? Certainly not. From the mental strain of prolonged underwater missions to the physical demands of operating complex machinery in confined spaces, each of these vessels faced challenges. Yet their contributions shaped the Navy's course, underscored the importance of underwater strengths in war, and provided tactical advantages in a way that surface vessels simply couldn't match. Take, for instance, the Sturgeon-class submarine, an extended and improved version of the Thresher/Permit class that predominantly featured during the Cold War. As SSNs, the Sturgeon-class submarines were primarily crafted to perform anti-submarine warfare operations. 7 different primary contractors built the 37 boats of the class. making it the second most numerous nuclear-powered warship class in the world. Only the Los Angeles class, with its 62 boats, tops it. You see, back in the 1950s, the US Navy realized that the Thresher/Permit class, the boats of which were then being constructed, needed to be refreshed and, well, re-engineered. They wanted something fast, but were still able to hit hard. The thirst for high-speed operations led to the creation of the Sturgeon class, and some design aspects were sacrificed. While its design retained the 5-compartment layout of the Permit class, which included the bow, operations, reactor, auxiliary machine room number 2, and engine room, these nuclear-powered Sturgeon-class submarines featured longer hulls to accommodate more advanced Mark 37 torpedoes and intelligence-gathering masts. However, the materials used weren't exactly out of the box. It mainly included high-strength steel for the hull to withstand deep-sea pressures, as well as nuclear reactors for extended underwater operations. But hey, simplicity can be bliss. The robust design ensured enhanced safety and reliability following the USS Thresher disaster. The sail's fairwater planes could even rotate 90 degrees, enabling the submarine to surface through thin ice. Yep, it was that cool. If you're a fan of top-tier weaponry, then you'll be pleased to know the Sturgeon class was no slouch. The armament of the Sturgeon class submarines was formidable, including Tomahawk and Harpoon missiles, the UU-M44 Subrock anti-submarine rocket, Mk-48 torpedoes, and various mines like the Mark 76 SLMM and Mark 60 Captor. Plus, their sophisticated sonar systems, including the BQQ sonar suite and towed arrays, provided exceptional underwater detection and targeting capabilities. The only downside regarding the whole modification was speed. Despite using the same S5W reactor as its predecessors, the enlarged sail and increased displacement meant the Sturgeon-class submarines had a top speed of 26 knots, slightly slower than the Thresher class, which could go up to 33 knots. Additionally, despite being an effective prop, I can't help but feel the smaller size of the Sturgeon class compared to others limited space for special operations teams and extended missions. It was a classic case of being a double-edged sword, a conundrum quite common at the time. Up next are the Barble-class submarines. Popular for being the last diesel-electric attack submarines built by the US Navy, this particular class of submarines was designed with numerous innovative features in mind. Remember the experimental USS Albacore? This particular vessel played a big role here. It served as the Barble's muse, making the class adopt its teardrop-shaped hull. Why, you may ask? Well, this interestingly shaped hull helped to minimize drag while maximizing its speed. But apart from those perks, the hull was also constructed with a 1.5-inch thick HY80 steel. And if you have no idea what that entails, a quick summary is that it's pretty high tensile steel that provides robustness and allows for deeper dives. Music to the ears of any navy, more so a nation as gargantuan as America. Additionally, the Barble were the first production warships whose designs included a single shaft configuration. It combined the control room, attack center, and conning tower into one space, therefore optimizing combat operations. During the Vietnam War, the Barble-class submarines were involved in all kinds of reconnaissance and surveillance missions, leveraging their neat diesel-electric propulsion for silent operations in coastal and riverine environments. Vessels like the USS Blueback conducted various missions, including surveillance, reconnaissance, and even direct support for surface fleet operations. They operated primarily in the Western Pacific, engaging in numerous deployments and supporting American efforts in Vietnam through training exercises, special operations, and serving as targets for anti-submarine warfare training. At the end of the Vietnam War, it received 2 campaign stars for its impressive service. In any case, this class of submarine was taken out of service in 1988 to 1990, leaving the US Navy with an entirely nuclear-powered submarine fleet. On the one hand, it marked the end of an era loved by many fans. But hey, on the other hand, we have nuclear-powered submarine fleets like those in the Sturgeon class. Arraignment-wise, the Barble class was equipped with 6 21-inch torpedo tubes in a 3/3 arrangement, capable of launching torpedoes for both offensive and defensive purposes. They also used the Mk-101 fire control system to manage their weapon systems effectively. But like that wasn't enough, the submarines also featured advanced sonar systems, including the BQ-S4 active sonar and BQ-R2 passive sonar, both of which enhance their ability to detect and engage enemy vessels. Looking back, the Barbel had a lot of positives. The streamlined design of the submarines in this class helped make it fast. Plus, the integration of the control room and attack center in a single shaft configuration helped to enhance its coordination during combat. This was largely made possible by the adoption of a push-button ballast control, yet another feature of the Albacore. While prior designs routed the trim system piping through the control room, where the valves were manually operated, the push-button system was a total game-changer. It used hydraulic operators on each valve, remotely electrically operated by some toggle switches from the control room. This massively optimized control room space and reduced the amount of time needed to perform trim operations. Overall, the layout made coordination of the weapons and ship control systems easier during combat operations. However, it was not the finished article. Remember when I told you the USS Albacore-inspired teardrop-shaped hull helped reduce drag? Well, the inclusion of the hull was a matter of great debate. Within the Navy, many believed two shafts offered redundancy, while others believed they improved maneuverability. Next, we have the Grayback-class submarines, which were absolutely crucial for the US Navy's covert operations, including the insertion and extraction of special forces. At the core of their design were two missile hangars, each capable of holding two Regulus II or four Regulus I missiles. However, with the cancellation of the former in December 1958, these submarines were primarily equipped with Regulus I missiles. That said, despite being initially designed as guided missile submarines, they were later converted to amphibious transport submarines. This involved removing the missile systems and outfitting the submarines to carry troops and equipment, making them versatile assets in amphibious operations. They were also built with a robust hull structure capable of withstanding deep dives and harsh underwater conditions. Armament-wise, the submarines carried the same torpedo armament as the Tang class, featuring 6 bow torpedo tubes and 2 stern tubes designed for swim-out weapons like the Mark 37 ASW homing torpedo. Alas, in their later years, the Grayback class underwent significant modifications to serve as amphibious transport submarines, including the use of torpedo tubes for self-defense and support of amphibious operations instead of Regulus I and II nuclear cruise missiles. The submarines also featured advanced sonar and electronic warfare systems to enhance their situational awareness and combat effectiveness. Additionally, the missile hangars were repurposed to store SEAL swimmer delivery vehicles or other specialized equipment for Navy SEALs and Marine Force recon units, further highlighting their versatility in covert operations. Submarines like the USS Grayback were modified to support special operations, including the deployment of SEAL teams using dry deck shelters. While manned, these submarines conducted covert reconnaissance, intelligence missions, and deployed special operation forces in hostile environments. The ships in this class were few, but iconic. Take for instance the USS Grayback, SSG-574, launched in 1957. Initially, it operated as a missile submarine from 1958 to 1964, but it was later converted into an amphibious transport submarine, serving in this capacity from 1969 until 1984. It played a crucial role in covert missions, leveraging its most modified hangars to support special forces. But sadly, the USS Grayback met its end as a target, being sunk near Subic Bay, Philippines, on April 13, 1986. And then we have the USS Growler. It did its time, but eventually got shelved to accommodate better vessels. But hey, it still stands to this day. Post-decommissioning, the USS Growler found a new life as a museum ship, and for decades it's been a part of the intrepid Sea Air Space Museum in New York City, where it serves as a proud testament to the innovative design and service of the Grayback-class submarines. Looking back, one thing I loved about this particular class was its versatility. Their ability to carry and deploy troops covertly post-conversion made them almost invaluable during the special operations. Plus, the fact that it could also remain submerged for extended periods provided strategic advantages in intelligence and surprise attacks. But speaking of which, it's also worth mentioning that the shift from missile-carrying capabilities to troop transport limited their direct offensive power. So again, the trend of sacrificial modifications was also evident in the Grayback class. Up next were the Tang-class submarines, designed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. This class marked a big leap forward in submarine technology, pushing the limits of submarine design and performance.
Take, for instance, the increase in test depth from 400 feet, or 120 meters, to 700 feet, or 210 meters. This enhancement was achieved using the same high-tensile steel with a yield strength of 42,000 psi as used in the Baleo and Tench classes. This depth capability allowed the Tangs to explore deeper ocean conditions to evade sonar detection and maneuver more safely at moderate depths. There was simply nothing like them at the time. But alas, the lofty ambitions of the Tangs were pushed too hard. The incorporation of the General Motors EMD 16338 lightweight compact high-speed pancake engine, rated at 1000 bhp, was largely unsuccessful. Unlike traditional diesel engines with horizontal crankshafts, this new engine had a vertical crankshaft with cylinders arranged radially, similar to an aircraft engine. 4 of these engines, each 13.5 feet tall and 4 feet wide, were intended to be installed in a single engine room, eliminating the need for a separate compartment and reducing the submarine's overall length. On the one hand, shorter submarines were believed to be more maneuverable and have less submerged drag. The Tang's streamlined hull and conning tower minimized drag, making a significant improvement over older designs that suffered up to a 50% speed loss due to structural drag. But, however, the compact, high-speed design of these engines proved difficult to maintain and prone to oil leaks. By 1956, the Navy decided to replace the problematic pancake engines with 3 10-cylinder Fairbanks-Morse opposed piston 38D 8/1/8 diesels, which were similar to those used in late World War II submarines, but uprated to 1600 shp each. Of course, accommodating the new, larger engines was unfeasible and needed further tweaking. The submarines had been lengthened by 9 feet in the engine room. But speaking of modifications, the torpedo tubes in the Tang class were also redesigned for enhanced performance. The 6 forward tubes used air-powered piston ejection pumps, which expelled a slug of water to push the torpedo out quietly, without releasing an air bubble. The stern tubes were also reduced to 2 shorter, simpler tubes, intended for swim-out torpedoes like the Mark 27 and the planned Mark 37, rather than the longer anti-ship torpedoes. So you see, the Tangs were unavoidably crucial. Its advanced features and innovations set the stage for contemporary submarine design, many of which are still used today. The only cons I could think of were its constant modifications. With the introduction of new technologies, a myriad of challenges came to light, such as maintenance complexities and the need for extensive training for crews to operate the advanced systems, all of which, to be fair, was a small price to pay in the grand scheme of things. Finally, we've got the skipjacks, one of the most crucial submarine classes for the US Navy. And no, it wasn't just because they were the first nuclear-powered fast attack submarines. Similarly to the Tang class, many of its features served as the foundation for subsequent generations of submarines, not only in the US Navy, but also around the world. And it all boiled down to its amazing design and construction. To start with, the skipjack class adopted the use of HY80 high-strength steel, with a yield strength of 80,000 psi. This material choice, while not initially used to increase diving depth, provided a robust and durable structure, setting a standard for future submarines. In fact, HY80 steel remained a standard in submarine construction through the Los Angeles class. Inspired by the USS Albacore's high-speed hull form, the skipjack also had a streamlined hull, reminiscent of a blimp. This body of revolution hull minimized surface seakeeping, but was optimized for exceptional underwater performance. And don't even get me started on the radical internal arrangement that combined the conning tower, control room, and attack center into one space, facilitating more efficient operations and coordination during combat. It complemented the introduction of push-button ballast control, which used hydraulic operators on valves remotely controlled from the control room. In all, this system conserved space and reduced the time needed for trim operations, marking a significant advancement in submarine control technology. Sounds familiar? Yeah, it was the same configuration used in the Barbel class. If you're a lover of skipjacks, you must know they include bow planes on the massive sail. But do you know the reason why? Popularly called sailplanes or fairwater planes, they helped reduce flow-induced noise near the bow sonar arrays. It was so good that the design was continued in all US nuclear submarines until the improved Los Angeles class, demonstrating its effectiveness and importance in submarine design. With all the aforementioned points, I'd have to understand if the Skipjack-class submarines had mediocre weaponry. After all, there has to be some sort of drawback, right? But it certainly wasn't about this department. Armed with 6 torpedo tubes capable of launching both conventional torpedoes and nuclear-tipped torpedoes, the Skipjacks were duly impressed. Plus, their advanced sonar systems and fire control computers also enhanced their targeting acquisition and engagement capabilities. And when you consider the fact that the Skipjacks were the first to be equipped with an S-5W nuclear reactor, what's not to love? Known during development as the Advanced Submarine Fleet Reactor, the ASFR became the most widely used in US nuclear submarines, powering 98 submarines across 8 classes, including the first British nuclear submarine, HMS Dreadnought. Which makes a lot of sense because the integration of the S-5W reactor provided reliable and efficient propulsion, significantly enhancing the operational capabilities of the Skipjack class. By introspection, the Skipjacks were a resounding success. Their nuclear propulsion and streamlined design made them the fastest US nuclear submarines until the Los Angeles-class submarines, the first of which entered service in 1974. However, I can't help but feel the complexity of nuclear reactors required rigorous maintenance and specialized training for the crew, which must have been a tough problem at the time. Plus, it was crazy expensive. Each hull cost around $40 million, which, as of the time of making this video, would have been over $400 million adjusted for current inflation. It was a load of fun unwrapping naval history once again, but sadly, that wraps up our rundown of the US Navy submarines that were total game changers in the theater of the Vietnam War. If you found it as thrilling as we did, make sure to hit the like button.
The US military oftentimes plays important roles in peacekeeping operations in other countries around the world, and the Lebanon conflict of 1982 was no different. What operations did the US military carry out during this war, and what artillery were deployed? Stay with us in this video to find out these and so much more. The Lebanon conflict between the country's pro-government and pro-Syrian factions lasted for many years, until a 1981 US-brokered ceasefire between the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel. However, the ceasefire was broken in June 1982 when an assassination attempt was made on Israel's ambassador to London. Although the Abu Nidal organization was responsible for this attack, Israel blamed the PLO and attacked Lebanon, resulting in a series of events that led to the formation of an international peacekeeping force to intervene. This force was called the Multi-Nation Force, and was made up of 4 participating nations and their special military regiments deployed to Lebanon. Great Britain had their 1st Queen's Dragoon Guards Armored Reconnaissance Regiment. France had 28 French Armored Forces regiments, 4 Foreign Legion regiments, and the 1st Inter-Armed Foreign and French Brigade, and the Italian deployed a number of paratrooper regiments and infantry units. The US military, however, deployed the US Multinational Force, which consisted of 4 different Marine amphibious units. These units are reinforced United States Marine Corps Infantry Battalion as the ground combat element, a medium tiltrotor squadron for aviation combat, a combat logistics battalion, and a command element that functions as the MEU headquarters group. With a war troop size of almost 4,400 trained personnel and infantry that has everything from tanks to ground attack and air support jets, it'd take hours to run through all the ships deployed during the Lebanon conflict. So we'll be mentioning only the vessels that played very vital roles in the conflict, starting with the Iwo Jima-class amphibious assault ships. The 7 ships in this class were the first amphibious assault ships designed and built by the US Navy as dedicated helicopter carriers. They were also the first ships capable of covering up to 20 helicopters to carry up to 1,800 Marines ashore. The first ship in this class was commissioned way back in 1961 as the successor of the Essex-class ships. While the functions of amphibious assault ships are often confused with that of a carrier, these warships were constructed to do a lot more than the average air carrier. They were used to support ground forces on enemy territory, while also serving as helicopter carriers, and during the conflict in Lebanon, these ships also served as the control station for the commander in charge. But like their predecessors, the Iwo Jimas had hangar areas designed to carry the increased weight of landing and parked aircraft, while still being able to support storing spare fuselages and parts, and accommodating working space for men in the lower areas. They also had 2 inboard elevators and a portside deck edge elevator positioned to not interfere with normal operations on deck. This elevator also increased the effective deck space by making extra parking room available. The vessels in this class also had better armor protection, better ventilation and lighting systems, better ammunition handling facilities, and very improved damage control equipment. For exact numbers, the Iwo Jimas measured a massive 592 feet in length, an 80-foot-4 long beam, and a draft of 27 feet. The propulsion engines consisted of 2 600 psi boilers, 1 geared steam turbine, and 1 shaft rated at 22,000 horsepower. Seeing as amphibious assault ships were very large vessels, they had a top speed of 22 knots, armament of 4 3-inch 50 caliber DP guns, and 8-cell Sea Sparrow BPDMS launchers. Having a troop capacity of over 2,100 and a complement of nearly 700, these vessels could also carry about 25 helicopters. Pretty impressive, but they were outclassed and outperformed during the Lebanon conflict by the Tarawa-class ships. This class of ships is originally regarded as the successor to the Iwo Jimas, with the construction of the 5 members taking place between 1971 and 1980. However, the Tarawa class wasn't like the previously built US Navy amphibious assault ships. Instead, they were specifically designed to be landing helicopter assault ships, and by the time of the Lebanon conflict, they were the most modern assault ships available for service. Although 9 ships were commissioned to be constructed in this class, only 5 were completed, with the designs for the original 4 being improved upon to put them in the Wasp class that were built later on. These 5 ships are the USS Tarawa, USS Saipan, USS Bellewood, USS Nassau, and USS Peleliu. Each of these vessels were built to have a full load displacement of 39,967 tons. And it's important to note that they were also much larger in size than the Iwo Jimas, measuring 834 feet in length with a beam of 131.9 feet and a draft of 25.9 feet. Like their predecessors, the Tarawa's propulsion was provided by 2 combustion engineering boilers fixed together to 2 Westinghouse turbines. However, these ships received a more effective 70,000 horsepower and were fitted with a bow thruster in addition to the main propulsion system. The Tarawas had a maximum speed of 24 knots and a maximum range of 10,000 nautical miles. You'd see it comprising 1 Mark 49 Ram surface-to-air missile system, 2 Vulcan Phalanx close-in weapon systems, 6 Mark 242 25mm automatic cannons, and 8 12.7mm machine guns. However, it's important to note that all of these were only added as part of modifications made to the class in the 90s. By the time of the Lebanon conflict, the amphibious warships had 2 Mark 25 Sea Sparrow missile systems, and 3 5-inch Mk-45 lightweight guns in bow and starboard aft sponsons. Each ship also had 4 Mark 36 SRB-OC launchers, 1 SLQ-25 Nixie towed torpedo, 1 CNAT unit, and 1 SLQ-49 shaft for countermeasures and decoys. Rather than the general helicopter carrier capacity of the previous assault ships, the Tarawa vessels were designed to specific capabilities. They could carry 19 Sikorsky CH-53 Sea Stallions, 26 Boeing Vertol CH-46 Sea Knights, or a mixture of the two, although some records show that they could power and operate up to 6 McDonnell Douglas AV-8B Harrier II jump jets. A few minor modifications would be necessary to enable this feature. After serving as part of the United States multinational force in the Lebanon conflict and a number of other overseas deployments, the Tarawas proved to be extremely efficient. This is why the class of amphibious assault ships that succeeded them had so many similarities to these ships. Moving on. Another set of ships used in the Lebanon conflict by the US Marines were the Austin-class amphibious transport dock ships. The 12 ships in this class are also referred to as landing platform docks and were used during the conflict to embark, transport, and land elements of landing force for expeditionary warfare missions. Essentially, they were used to carry out the missions of amphibious transports, amphibious cargo ships, and the older dock landing ships. Unlike those specialized vessels, these ships had both a flight deck and a well deck, which meant they could be ballasting and deballasting to support landing craft or any form of amphibious vehicles.
While the US Navy has now replaced LSDs, like the Austin-class with the LPDs, back in 1982 when the US joined the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, these ships were the best around. The vessels in this class are often referred to as an enlarged version of the preceding Rayleigh class, which had dimensions of 522 feet in length, a beam of 107 feet, and a draft of 22 feet. Originally, the Austin-class ships were about 47 feet longer, with similar draft size, deballast, and 2 feet less in the beam. The dock of these ships had a 70-meter-long raised level designed to park vehicles, which was connected through a ramp to the flight deck, the ramp in question being structured to serve as a telescoping hangar at the other end. The engine featured 2 boilers that powered the 2 de Laval GT turbines and provided 12,000 shp for each of the 2 propellers. Although these vessels also had a flight deck that could occupy up to 6 CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters, the hangar was only used as a temporary shelter for a single helicopter and not a permanent facility. Seeing as they are transport ships, it's no surprise that these ships were only designed to have a very light armament of just 4 3-inch 50 caliber gun Mark 33 twin mounts. While on deployments, like the Lebanese War, these ships could carry many different watercraft combos, like 1 LCAC, 1 LCU, and 3 LCM-6, 4 LCM-8, 9 LCM-6, or 24 AAVs. For personnel, the complement of each of these vessels in the class includes 24 officers, 396 enlisted, and 900 Marines. Lastly, we'll be looking at the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, which played very important roles in the conflict. When the Lebanon War broke out in 1982, the Reagan administration deployed some ships to reduce the possibility of the eruption of a larger regional war, and the Nimitz-class ships were some of the first vessels called into action. The nuclear-powered Nimitz-class supercarrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, with its battle group, had been serving in the Mediterranean when the war began, but were called upon to assist with the evacuation of American citizens in Lebanon who had been involved in the conflict. Soon after, a number of other carrier battle groups were deployed to make up a 50-ship task force, with 4 carriers and their air wings at the core. Essentially, the Nimitz-class ships were at the front line of establishing a strong stance for the United States and NATO, although the US government also intended to have these ships take part in rescue attempts of other Americans still in Lebanon. Although the infamous siege of Beirut lasted for a few months, within days the situation had been stabilized enough, so some of the Nimitz-class carriers were withdrawn to serve other purposes away from frontline action. The ships in this class were designed to supplement the aircraft carriers of Kitty Hawk and Enterprise classes after the US Navy decommissioned a number of older carriers. Because of this, the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers featured a lot of improvements on previous US carriers. Some of the most notable improvements include the Nimitz's use of 2 reactors, which took up less space than the 8 reactors used on Enterprise, and the capacity to carry 90% more aviation fuel and 50% more ordnance when compared to the Forrestal class that had come before them. These ships also had the ability to withstand 3 times the damage sustained by the Essex-class assault ships during World War II. This feature was enabled by dividing the hangars of the Nimitz-class ships into 3 fire bays by thick steel doors to restrict the spread of fire. The United States Navy had suffered many kamikaze attacks from the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Second World War, which is what prompted the inclusion of this design. The Nimitz ships were also constructed with consideration of flaws exploited in other carriers during the Vietnam War, ongoing at the time of their construction. Previous carriers had been constructed with the idea of survivability in mind, rather than the efficiency on a battlefield, as they were rarely subject to enemy attack. To counter this, the Nimitz had larger stores of aviation fuel and larger magazines. They used nuclear power instead of oil for greater endurance. It had the inclusion of new intelligence and technological developments to make their weapon systems readily adjustable. All the ships in this class were powered by 2 A4W nuclear reactors, housed in separate compartments, and had 4 propeller shafts, which produced a maximum speed of over 30 knots. Their engines also featured bulbous bows to improve fastness of speed and fuel efficiency by reducing wave-making resistance.
For their armament, all the Nimitz-class carriers, except USS Ronald Reagan, had either 2 or 3 RIM-7 Sea Sparrow or RIM-162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile Mk-29 missile launchers, which were used to defend against aircraft and anti-ship missiles. They also had 3 or 4 20mm Phalanx CIWS, 4 Sipican Super Rapid Bloom offboard chaff, 6-barrel Mk-36 decoy launchers for deploying infrared flares and chaff to disrupt the sensors of incoming missiles, and an SSTDS torpedo defense system. Other countermeasures include an AN/SLQ-25 Nixie torpedo and an AN/SLQ-32 jamming system for the purpose of hostile radar signals detection. The USS Ronald Reagan was built exclusively with Mk-49 guided missile launching systems for RIM-116 rolling airframe missiles, although these weapons were later installed on a couple of other members of her class after the Lebanon War. In addition to all these features, the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers used a Kato bar arrangement for their angled flight decks for aircraft operations. This design not only made flight deck operations faster, but also made room for a wider variety of aircraft than that of previous carriers. The ships also deployed an embarked carrier air wing comprising around 64 aircraft and had FA-18E and FA-18F Super Hornets as their air wing strike fighters. Although they served in the Lebanon conflict all those decades ago, the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers are still up there with the most lethal and effective carriers ever designed for the US Navy and Marines. Lebanon, a nation celebrated for its amazing culture, breathtaking Mediterranean coastline, and rich history that can actually go back thousands of years. But what if I told you this beautiful nation, loved and adored by many today, almost imploded, nearly buried under the sands of time? If it weren't for submarines and the clandestine strength of the US Navy, Lebanon's fate might have been sealed. But how? How exactly were they able to do this? And why are their legendary feats almost unknown? Let's find out together in today's video. For all its beauty, Lebanon has often been overshadowed by its turbulent history and incessant conflict. From the devastating civil war to the 2008 political crisis, the nation has frequently been at the heart of regional and global power struggles. Yet, among these, I can't help but feel that the 1958 crisis stands out. Many view the 1958 conflict as a heated internal skirmish. The truth is far more complex, and the implications are far-reaching. It was a crucial moment in the nation's history that set it on a path it still treads today. So what really happened? At first, the 1958 Lebanon crisis came to life when President Camille Chamoun, a pro-Western leader, sparked outrage by seeking a second term, something many perceived as unconstitutional. This move intensified existing tensions, especially among Lebanon's Muslim population, who were said to be inspired by the wave of Arab nationalism and looked to leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. At the time, many saw Chamoun's close ties with Western powers as a betrayal, particularly after he refused to distance Lebanon from the Baghdad Pact following the Suez Crisis. One thing led to another. Push came to shove, and what started as political unrest quickly spiraled into violent clashes across the country, plunging Lebanon into chaos. It was total pandemonium. I'm talking waves and waves of unrest and violence. Fearing that this unrest could spread and destabilize the region, the United States had to intervene under the Eisenhower Doctrine, marking America's first direct military involvement in the Middle East during the Cold War. So began Operation Blue Bat, with a deployment of more than 14,000 troops and backed by a formidable naval fleet to stabilize the situation and bring decorum to the state. Commonly known as the Sixth Fleet, the naval vessels were sent to the Mediterranean to take control of key points, like the port of Beirut. But while most people knew the fleet included a significant number of surface ships like aircraft carriers such as the USS Essex and the USS Wasp, cruisers like the USS Boston, and even a couple of destroyer squadrons, there's reason to believe submarines were also a part of the US Navy's expeditions, just in a different way. Although specific records of submarine involvement in this operation remain largely secret to date,
partially due to the classified nature of submarine operations and the focus on surface ship actions during this particular intervention. The typical submarines that would have been utilized by the Navy at the time included World War II-era Baleo and Tench-class submarines, both of which were still in service. Now, the reason why I believe both of these classes were actually used boils down to their functionalities. Starting with the Baleo-class submarines. Each of the vessels in this class marked a significant step forward in US naval technology from the earlier Gatto class. Designed with thicker, high-strength steel for their pressure hulls, these submarines could dive deeper than their predecessors, achieving test depths of up to 400 feet, with some like the USS Tang even surpassing this limit during real-world operations. Honestly, it was a no-brainer. The increased depth capability of the Baleo class was crucial for avoiding enemy detection and surviving depth charge attacks, both of which the Gatto class struggled against. Secondly, the Baleo class also had refined conning towers and periscope shears. Early in the war, US submarines had bulky and large fairwaters, making them easier targets. The Baleo class boats, however, were built with more streamlined conning towers, which reduced their silhouette and made them more challenging to detect on the surface. By the time the boats were launched, lessons from patrol reports had been incorporated into the design. The bridge and sail were efficiently laid out, well-equipped, and highly regarded by the crews. And don't even get me started on its propulsion system. Similarly to the Gatto, Baleos used diesel-electric propulsion engines, except that they were much better. Earlier submarines used 4 high-speed electric motors, 2 per shaft. That required reduction gears to slow their output to a suitable speed for their shafts. However, this setup was very noisy, making the submarines easier to detect with hydrophones. To counter this issue, many of the late Baleo-class submarines were fitted with low-speed double-armature motors that directly drove the shafts, resulting in much quieter operations. Although it's worth mentioning that this improvement was not widely implemented until the succeeding Tench class. Luckily though, the armament of the early Baleo-class submarines made their noise forgivable. Initially armed with a 4-inch deck gun, Baleos were subsequently upgraded to a more powerful 5-inch 25 caliber deck gun as the war progressed, giving them substantial surface engagement capability. But just when you'd think it was enough, Baleos were then complemented by anti-aircraft weapons, including Bofors 40mm and Oerlikon 20mm cannons, which were necessary to defend against enemy aircraft, a pretty common threat in naval battles. Finally, the Baleo class was also equipped with the capacity to carry up to 48 mines per trip, providing a versatile offensive capability beyond their torpedoes. Looking back, it's easy to see why the Baleo was the most numerous US submarine class. From 1943 through 1948, 120 of these boats were commissioned. Perhaps the most famous was the Tang, which I briefly talked about earlier. Under the command of Richard O'Kane, the Tang was one of the most successful submarines ever used by the Navy in wars, sinking 33 ships before being tragically lost to a circular run of its own torpedo. And then there was also the USS Archerfish, which sank the Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Alas, despite their immense success, the Baleo class also faced losses. 9 submarines were lost during World War II, and additional boats were lost post-war in accidents or in service with foreign navies. The USS Cochino was lost due to an accidental fire in 1949, and the ARE Santa Fe, formerly the USS Catfish, was disabled during the Falklands War in 1982 before being scuttled. In any case, I'd personally rate the Baleo as a winner. The enhanced hulls made them more resilient to depth charges and underwater pressures. Plus, they also had improved armor, more efficient diesel engines, and improved fuel storage, which allowed them to conduct extended patrols in theaters. But hey, I'll be the first to say it wasn't perfect. The Baleo-class submarines were relatively poorly equipped to defend against air attacks, which became increasingly common as the wars progressed. Additionally, in spite of the improvements made, the Baleo-class submarines still had some acoustic signatures, which increased their chances of being detected by enemy sonar, thus limiting their stealth capabilities, at least compared to more contemporary designs like Tench, the next class on our list. Built between 1944 and 1951, Tench boats were a direct evolution of earlier Gatto and Baleo classes. Yes, they were only slightly larger by about 35 to 40 tons, but still, these boats had more robust construction. It was basically like the Baleo, but on steroids. You don't believe me? Well then, you just wait to have a major shock. Ordinarily, the Baleos were a good submarine class, but they had a major flaw. You see, riser pipes passed through the interior of the boat in the forward and aft torpedo rooms, allowing air to vent during diving and water to flood in. However, these pipes, when filled with water under full submergence pressure, posed a serious risk. If ruptured during depth charge attacks, they could cause catastrophic flooding inside the torpedo rooms. To mitigate this issue, designers took things up a notch with a snazzy redesign. To start with, the No. 1 main ballast tank was relocated forward of the pressure hull, allowing it to vent directly into the superstructure like the other ballast tanks, thus eliminating the dangerous riser pipes entirely. And like that wasn't already enough, the redundant No. 7 MBT was converted into a variable fuel oil ballast tank, significantly extending the submarine's range and allowing it to travel up to 16,000 nautical miles, marking a substantial increase from the 11,000 nautical miles possible with earlier classes. Now, this one is often hushed in most history books, but another improvement of the Tench over its predecessors was the removal of small bulges around the motor room that previously housed the reduction gears. Submarine crews had requested this change much earlier, but sadly it couldn't be accommodated in previous designs due to the limited space in the torpedo rooms. In any case, the reason why this configuration is worthy of celebration is that it allows these submarines to carry 4 additional torpedoes in the forward torpedo room, bringing the total to 28. Speaking of weapons, the Tench-class submarines featured powerful and versatile armament, particularly in terms of mine-laying capabilities. Like their predecessors, including the Baleo class, the Tang class could substitute torpedoes with mines, enhancing its strategic flexibility. At some point, the submarines could carry up to 56 mines by replacing each torpedo with 2 mines. However, it's worth mentioning that the operational doctrine typically required submarines to retain at least 4 torpedoes, which adjusted the practical mine capacity. In actual combat situations, Tench-class submarines often carried at least 8 torpedoes, which allowed for a balanced approach between offensive engagements and mine-laying operations. The largest minefields laid during the war consisted of 32 mines, showcasing the significant threat these submarines posed to enemy shipping lanes. Looking back, the only obvious con I can think of regarding the Tench stems from its curative approach. I mean, yeah, it was mainly built to fix the inadequacies of its predecessors, but I can't help but feel like it came at a cost. The improvements in the internal layout, particularly the rearrangement of ballast tanks and associated piping, made the construction and maintenance of these submarines more complex compared to their predecessors. And of course, those metrics have a nasty way of seeping into longer construction times and more challenging repairs. Were the flaws worth it though? Definitely. Both of these classes were instrumental for the Navy in securing wins, and, in this case, offering normalcy and decorum to the war-torn Mediterranean region at the time. I'm only saddened by the fact that Lebanon is still facing significant threats to this day. At the moment, the nation's instability is further exacerbated by its internal political and economic crisis. With the assassination of Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr in Beirut and Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, there are fears that a border regional conflict is on the horizon. As a matter of fact, the US and other Western nations have already urged their citizens to evacuate Lebanon, indicating concerns that the situation could deteriorate rapidly and possibly cause significant civilian harm and border regional destabilization. For now, the United States has sent a guided missile submarine, the USS Georgia, to the Middle East as tensions grow in the region. Given how Lebanon's economy is already fragile and weakened by years of political instability, there's even more reason to be worried. Earlier, the World Bank had cautiously predicted modest economic growth of 0.2%, driven by remittances and tourism. But with things taking a drastic turn, it's likely going to get worse. The national currency has lost 95% of its value since the economy collapsed in 2019, and over 80% of the population now lives below the poverty line. In any case, despite the current turbulence, there is hope that diplomatic efforts and international pressure might lead to a resolution. The US is known for its worthy influence, and the Navy is dishing out its more capable vessels at the moment. Plus, a carrier is conveying it to the area to make it arrive quicker. Capable of both strategic deterrence and direct action, submarines have been one of the Navy's best line of defenses in combating heated tensions for years. And the USS Georgia is just a prime example. As a converted Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine that has been reconfigured as a guided missile submarine, the Georgia is blessed with insane operational flexibility. From strike operations to special operations support and even intelligence gathering, the USS Georgia can handle a lot of activities in the region. Plus, it's also a heavy hitter. Equipped with 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles, the USS Georgia can deliver precise, long-range strikes against a wide range of targets. And that, guys, is why if you want to keep abreast of the latest developments and the worthy stories of maritime behemoths, then this is the place to be. When the Gulf War broke out in August 1990, the United States led a coalition of 42 countries against Iraq. However, of the 42 countries, the US Navy played the biggest part thanks to their advanced technology and lethal munitions. Which US Navy ships were deployed, and what roles did they play in the Persian Gulf conflict? Stay with us in this video to find out. By the build-up to the Gulf War in the late 1980s, the US Navy had become one of the most formidable in the world, having a wide range of advanced warships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and other frigates. Because of these, fleets of different models of watercraft were deployed at different stages of the war. For this video, we'll be looking only at the ships that played major roles in the conflict, starting with the Knox-class frigates. Originally designed as ocean escorts, this class of frigates were the largest, last, and most numerous of the US Navy's second-generation anti-submarine warcraft escorts, with 46 member ships. All of the ships in this class had been constructed in the early 70s, so by the time the Gulf War broke out, they were all in the twilight of their service. However, those deployed to the Persian Gulf were still able to serve in very important capacities despite their age. One of her members, the USS Barbey, for example, was originally sent to the region as part of a peacetime deployment, but her mission was quickly altered when hostiles in Iraq began invading the Emirate of Kuwait. Barbey was employed to enforce the sanctions specified by UN resolutions, and together with her embarked helicopter detachment, HSL-35 Magnus 32, she performed more surface ship interdiction intercepts than any other fleet unit in the AG during the period. She served in interdiction and escort operations for most of the early months of the war, holding the front line until more lethal ships could be sent out. Another Knox-class frigate, USS Vreeland, had participated in the United States invasion of Panama in the events that led to the Gulf War. So when the war did break out, Vreeland was deployed to take part in Operation Desert Storm. Some of her crew members were also assigned to the multinational interception force during this time. What made the Knox-class ships so useful during these early stages of the war was that these ships were originally planned to be an improvement on the gun-armed and missile-equipped that had come before her. After there were changes due to construction issues, the Knox-class ships were designed with two 1,200 psi boilers each, one Westinghouse steam turbine, and a single shaft. By the time of the Gulf War, the ships had been refitted with hurricane bows to prevent deck wetness, and bulwarks and spray strakes were added to prevent burrowing into oncoming seas for forecastle armament protection. Called the AN/SQS-35V, Independent Variable Depth Sonar, an 8-round basic point defense missile system launcher, and a .79-inch Phalanx CIWS aft. For the short-range surface-to-air missile system, most of the Knox had the RIM 7 Sea Sparrow missile, although USS Downs had a NATO Sea Sparrow launcher instead. They also had designs which allowed them to launch Harpoon anti-ship missiles from the ASROC launcher. This carried 2 Harpoons, while the other 2 were in the ship's ASROC magazine. Their original armament also included a 5-inch 54 caliber Mark 42 gun, 1 Mk16 8-cell ASROC launcher, and 2 dual Mark 32 Mark 46 torpedo launchers. We should also mention that although these frigates weren't aircraft carriers, their refitted designs by the Gulf War allowed them to carry 1 SH-2 Sea Spirit helicopter. Moving on, the most widely used destroyers during the Gulf War were the Spruance-class warships. Built to replace the Allen M. Sumner and Gearing-class destroyers, these ships were the primary destroyers of the US Navy during the 1970s and 1980s. They were designed to be much larger than the other destroyers of the era, similar in size to contemporary guided missile cruisers. The size made them not only the first destroyers to have room to accommodate a helicopter flight deck, but also the first to have an enclosed hangar with space for up to 2 medium-lift helicopters. The Spruance-class ships were also the first large US Navy ships to have gas turbine propulsion, as they were designed for the 4 General Electric LM2500 gas turbines that generated up to 80,000 horsepower. Although their original armament of 2 guns and an ASROC and Sea Sparrow missile launcher were considered weak, the entire class later received quadruple Harpoon missile launchers. It's also important to note that every ship in this class could carry Sikorsky SH-60 Seahawk LAMPS III helicopters. Some members of the class also had armored box launcher Tomahawk surface-to-surface missiles, while others had a 61-cell Mark 41 vertical launch missile system for the Tomahawk. Others had 2 quadruple Harpoon missile canisters, 2 20mm Phalanx CIWS Mark 15 gun, 2 quadruple ABL Mark 143 Tomahawk missile launchers, and a few had 1 21-cell rolling airframe missile launcher each. By the time of the Persian Gulf War, some Spruance-class warships received upgrades, like the test installation of AN/SPQ-9B anti-ship missile defense fire control radar, and the mounting of 1 21-cell Mark 49 RIM 116 rolling airframe missile launcher in the starboard fantail of some memberships. One of the members of this class, USS Paul F. Foster, was the first ship to fire Tomahawk missiles against Iraqi targets from the Persian Gulf, and she was also very useful in the liberation of Kuwait. Another Spruance-class destroyer, USS Harry W. Hill, served in both Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, until her unfortunate collision with the Wichita-class replenishment oiler USS Kansas City. The most successful ship in this class during the Gulf War was the USS Moosbrugger, which was part of the first United States response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Moosbrugger performed a ton of important duties during the war, from delaying her Suez transit by several weeks, to taking a station in the North Red Sea entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba to support enforcement of UN Iraq sanctions. She also conducted many search and seizure operations in 1990, before getting assigned Maritime Interdiction Patrol in early 1991. Moosbrugger remained at the Gulf of Aqaba, stopping, boarding, and searching merchant vessels flagged by nations sympathetic to Iraq to prevent the supply of war materials. This ship being awarded the Navy Unit Commendation for service during the Persian Gulf War sums up just how effective she and other members of her class were. Another important class of ships in the US Navy's service during the Gulf War were the Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers. Unlikely as it may seem, these class of ships were designed based on that of the Spruance-class destroyer, but after many modifications, they proved to be way more lethal. Introducing a new generation of guided missile warships, the Ticonderoga class had the Aegis-phased array radar, making them capable of simultaneously scanning for threats, tracking targets, and guiding missiles to interception. By the time of their design, these ships had the most powerful electronic warfare equipment and the most advanced underwater surveillance system in the entire US Navy. They were designed with superstructures that could support 2 deck houses, and had an aft deck house that contained both the aft and port antenna arrays. Being multi-role warships, the Ticonderoga-class ships had Mark 41 VLS that fired Tomahawk cruise missiles. These missiles could strike both land targets and anti-aircraft, SM-2MR-ERs for defense. The Ticonderoga also had LAMPS III helicopters, RUM-139 ASROCs, and sonar systems, which made them effective for anti-submarine warfare missions. And that's not all. Initially, the main armament of these ships were Mark 26 guided missile systems, but when they proved too manpower intensive, they were replaced with far more capable and versatile Mk-41 vertical launching system and Mark 45 127mm gun systems. A considerable number of Ticonderoga-class ships also had 2 Mark 41 vertical launching systems, which allowed the ships to have 122 missile storage and launching tubes that could carry many different missiles. Comprehensively, the main armament of this class of ships includes 2 Mark 26 missile launchers, 68 RIM 66 SM-2, 20 RUR-5 ASROCs, 8 RGM-84 Harpoon missiles, 2 5-inch 54 caliber Mark 45 lightweight guns, 4 dual 50-inch caliber machine guns, 2 Phalanx CIWS, 2 Mk-32 12.75-inch triple torpedo tubes, 2 61-cell Mk-41 vertical launch systems, and 8 RGM-84 Harpoon missiles. Add the limited Kevlar splinter armor protection in critical areas, and the 2 MH-60R Seahawk Lamps Mk-3 helicopters these ships carried, and it's no wonder the Ticonderoga-class vessels were so successful in the Persian Gulf War. A member of the class USS Mobile Bay became the first Aegis cruiser to circumnavigate the globe when deployed to support Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. She offered very stellar service all through the conflict, becoming the first Battle Force anti-air warfare commander to control a 4-carrier task force and launching 22 Tomahawk land attack cruise missile strikes. This ship also directed carrier-launched attack aircraft to destroy 38 Iraqi naval vessels, resulting in the complete neutralization of the Iraqi Navy, and was useful in the evacuation of thousands of people displaced by the volcanic eruption of Mount Pinatubo during the war. Pretty impressive stuff, right? And she's not the only Ticonderoga that was of great service to the US Navy in the Gulf War. Her sister ship, USS Antietam, was one of the first vessels to take part in Operation Desert Shield, and was involved in a helicopter rescue of 2 British SAS troops. Another member of this class, USS Princeton, and her crew were awarded the Combat Action Ribbon after getting attacked during Operation Desert Storm. This video will not be complete, however, without the inclusion of the Charles F. Adams class ships. A class of 29 guided missile destroyers was built between 1958 and 1967. These ships were the first class designed to serve as guided missile destroyers. They were also the last steam turbine-powered destroyers built for the US Navy, but despite their outdated technology, these class of ships played vital roles in the US Navy neutralizing the Iraqi Navy in the Gulf War. Take USS Sampson, for example. This ship was with the USS Saratoga battle group in support of Desert Shield and Storm. On the battlefield, she conducted the first boarding and search of a merchant during the operation, and the first diversion of a ship with prohibited cargo. She then proceeded to operate with the ships of various NATO navies, bolstering surveillance operations and protecting shipping in the approaches to the Suez Canal. Another Charles F. Adams ship, the USS Goldsboro, was one of those deployed with a battle group centered around the aircraft carrier CVN-70 before the war even started. As part of that group, Goldsboro conducted missions in and around the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, having received the advanced sensor and communications upgrade. This upgrade enabled her to monitor air activity inside Iranian borders and contribute to Operation Earnest Will before the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. There's also the USS Tattnall, which joined vessels from several other NATO countries to form Naval On-Call Forces Mediterranean. As part of this unit, Tattnall conducted joint operations like Dragon Hammer and made many port visits to Cagliari, Barcelona, Marseille, and Naples. She was also used as the host of a reception for diplomatic representatives from around the world in the heat of the war, before she was deployed to the Suez Canal and to the Red Sea in support of Desert Shield. Generally, the Charles F. Adams class were guided missile destroyers with full load displacement of 4,526, and propulsion engines of 2 steam turbines providing 52,000 kW or power to 2 shafts. They had 4 1,275 psi boilers, a top speed of 33 knots, and a maximum range of 4,500 nautical miles. For sensor systems, each ship had one AN/SPS-10 surface search radar, one AN/SPS-37 air search radar, one AN/SPS-39 air search 3D radar, 2 AN/SPG-51 Tartar fire control radar, one AN/SPG-53 gun fire control radar, and AN/SQS-23 sonar. The armament of these ships underwent only little upgrades as it proved efficient during not just the Gulf War, but also the Vietnam War and the blockade of Cuba in 1962, decades earlier, or one Mark 13 single-arm missile launcher for the RIM-24 Tartar SAM system. Later on, they were fitted with the RIM-66 Standard and Harpoon anti-ship missiles to complement the 2 5-inch 54 caliber Mark 42 guns, one RUR-5 ASROC launcher, and 2 Mark 32 surface vessel torpedo tubes. The Persian Gulf War was a battle for self-preservation on one hand and justice on the other.
When push came to shove, the US Navy stepped up yet again to change the tide of the conflict with its silent yet formidable presence. Everyone knows the might of America quelled the battle for the ages in the Middle East. But here's the million-dollar question. Was her success as monumental as history suggests, or did it pave the way for unseen consequences in the years to come? Find out the burning answers and lots more in today's video. If there is one war that reshaped the Middle East into what it is today, it has to be the Persian Gulf War. Driven by economic and territorial ambitions, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded its smaller next-door neighbor Kuwait on August 2, 1990. The goal was simple: to seize control of Kuwait's vast oil reserves to address Iraq's financial and economic problems following the Iran-Iraq War. Yep, you heard it right. Saddam Hussein's grand plan to boost Iraq's economy, pay off debts and gain greater control over the global oil market was plunging into Kuwait's grail resource. Plus, it didn't help the fact that Iraq had accused Kuwait of overproducing oil, which drove down prices and harmed Iraq's economy. The second reason for the invasion, however, was a perceived right. You see, Iraq claimed that Kuwait was historically part of its territory, and taking it back was simply a reversion to the natural order. Were they right? I'd leave that for you to say. By invading Kuwait, Saddam Hussein aimed to assert Iraq's dominance in the region and gain significant economic and strategic advantages. In any case, the swift invasion posed a significant threat to the stability of the oil-rich Persian Gulf region. Europe and America had a big crisis on their hands, and peace was the only solution. At first, the United Nations condemned Iraq and imposed economic sanctions on the nation, but when the diplomatic efforts failed to resolve the crisis, the stage was set for military intervention. Leading a coalition of 35 nations, the United States swiftly commenced Operation Desert Storm, the codename for the combat phase of the Gulf War, to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait and restore peace to the region. As part of this massive military effort, the US Navy deployed key submarines to enforce naval blockades and launch devastating Tomahawk land attack missile strikes. But as funny as it sounds, did you know that only 2 submarines were primarily used by the US Navy in the 1991 Persian Gulf War? One of the first to be deployed during the conflict was the USS Louisville, arguably one of the best powerhouses of the Los Angeles class at the time. Whether it was stealth or precision, Louisville was pivotal in almost all of the Navy's attacks. But why? I mean, sure, it was a nuclear-powered attack submarine that represented a unique blend of advanced naval engineering and strategic capability, but given how a couple of submarines also fit the bill, what about this behemoth makes it so special? Commissioned in November 1986, the USS Louisville was built by the General Dynamics Electric Boat Division in Groton, Connecticut. And as you'd expect from a Los Angeles-class submarine, the design of the Louisville focused on speed, stealth, and the ability to operate at various depths. But while the aforementioned categories makes it a formidable vessel in the US Navy's fleet, it's also worth mentioning that the Louisville's hull was constructed using high-strength, low-alloy steel, which allowed it to withstand the intense pressures of deep-sea operations. At the time of its creation, the US Navy wanted a submarine that could perform all kinds of operations and missions, ranging from intelligence gathering to launching precision strikes, all while remaining undetected, and Louisville did just that. Take for instance the Persian Gulf War, when the Louisville actually became the first submarine to launch Tomahawk land attack missiles, TLMAs, in combat. Never heard of it? Alright. To put it simply, TMLAs are long-range, all-weather subsonic cruise missiles equipped with sophisticated guidance systems that allow them to hit targets with high precision from a distance. These deadly missiles targeted Iraqi command and control centers, air defense sites, and other critical infrastructure. So you see, Louisville's ability to launch these strikes from submerged positions made it an invaluable asset to the US Navy's fleet during the conflict in the Gulf War. But speaking of strikes, I'll let you know that the USS Louisville was armed with a powerful and versatile range of weaponry designed to handle a wide range of combat scenarios. It featured 4 21-inch bow torpedo tubes capable of launching the formidable Mk-48 ADCAP torpedoes with superior guidance and propulsion systems. And just like earlier teased, the Louisville was also equipped with Tomahawk land attack missiles, specifically the Block 3 variant of the submarine-launched cruise missile, or SLCM.
These missiles had an impressive range of 1,700 nautical miles, allowing Louisville to strike targets deep inland with pinpoint accuracy. But like that wasn't enough. The Louisville was also capable of laying mines, including the Mk-67 mobile mines and the Mk-60 captor mines, which were designed to intercept enemy submarines and disrupt enemy movements. And guess what? The submarine came with a wide range of advanced technologies that enhanced its combat effectiveness and situational awareness during operations. Among these was the BQQ-5 passive sonar, which could detect and classify sounds in the water without emitting signals that could give away its position. And the BQS-15 detecting and ranging sonar, which provided the Louisville with the ability to actively ping and determine the range and bearing of other objects in the water. This particular feature was crucial for close-quarter detection and when precision in targeting or evasion was required. Was Louisville perfect, though? Not quite. The design of the Louisville had several pros and cons. On the positive side, its nuclear propulsion allowed it to remain submerged for extended periods, providing both endurance and stealth. Additionally, the vessel had a top speed of over 20 knots, which is around 23 miles per hour or 37 kilometers per hour, whether surfaced or submerged. This impressive speed allowed the Louisville to quickly reposition in response to evolving threats, making it agile and elusive during operations. Plus, with the quieting technologies incorporated into its design, such as the use of sound-absorbing tiles and advanced propeller designs, the submarine was actually difficult for enemy forces to detect. However, there were also some drawbacks to the Los Angeles-class design. To start with, although the Louisville's design was cutting edge at the time of its commissioning, advancements of sonar and anti-submarine warfare technologies have since diminished some of its stealth advantages. Secondly, given its massive size, it's hard to imagine the USS Louisville didn't struggle with maneuverability in certain marine environments in the Middle East, especially when compared to smaller submarines. Is it grand enough to be tagged as a major drawback? Not quite. But hey, it's still worth mentioning nonetheless, especially when the second submarine on our list is none other than the USS Pittsburgh. Similar to the USS Louisville, Pittsburgh was also a Los Angeles-class nuclear-powered attack submarine. It was named after the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and its origin story began in the late 70s, when the United States had a fiery passion to enhance its naval capabilities during the Cold War. As a Los Angeles-class submarine, it was designed to counter the growing Soviet submarine threat, focusing on improved speed, stealth, and advanced weaponry. Interestingly, the Pittsburgh was the 33rd submarine of its class, further buttressing just how emphatic the US Navy desired an ideal fleet capable of dominating both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Built by General Dynamics Electric Boat, the Pittsburgh construction incorporated several advanced features that were cutting edge at the time, such as improved sonar systems and the capability to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles. But before we get into all that, can you guess what the Pittsburgh's hull was made of? Aluminum? Titanium? Composite materials? Well, if your answer isn't high-strength HY80 steel, then you've probably not been paying attention to our channel. This material provides the necessary durability, wieldability, and flexibility to withstand the immense pressure experienced under high pressure. In the case of the USS Pittsburgh, a teardrop-shaped hull was implemented to optimize hydrodynamic efficiency, allowing for higher speeds, both on the surface and while submerged. It also minimized drag, enabling the submarine to achieve speeds in excess of 20 knots while submerged. During the Persian Gulf War, the USS Pittsburgh played a crucial role in many of the naval operations, most especially Operation Desert Storm, where it participated in critical strike missions against Iraq. Equipped with 4 21-inch torpedo tubes, Mk-48 ADCAP torpedoes, and Tomahawk land attack missiles, which had a range of 1,700 nautical miles, Pittsburgh was just as effective as Louisville in terms of striking targets. But personally, I also love the fact that it could deploy M67 mobile mines and Mk-60 captor mines. It made it more than just a threat to surface ships. Plus, it was no slouch in cognizance either. The submarine's BQQ-5 passive sonar system, along with other advanced detection equipment, gave it a significant tactical advantage to track enemy vessels and avoid detection, both of which were crucial for coordinating coalition forces and ensuring the success of broader military operations. In any case, the Pittsburgh was an exceptional submarine at the time. It could stand toe-to-toe with any other nuclear-powered fast attack submarine in its class, as well as those owned outside of the US, However, I can't help but feel its design highlighted both the strengths and weaknesses typical of its class. I'll start with the former. As a Los Angeles-class submarine, it's fair to say the USS Pittsburgh was designed for high speeds both on the surface and submerged. In fairness, its ability to reach and even exceed 20 knots checked this box. Submarines need to quickly position themselves for attack, evasion, and reconnaissance missions, and Pittsburgh's rapid pace allowed it to do just that. The fact that it was also equipped with sophisticated sonar systems like the BQQ-5 passive sonar and the BQS-15 detecting and ranging sonar made it a noble asset. The aforementioned systems provided superior underwater detection capabilities, allowing submarines to track and engage enemy vessels during conflicts. Yet, it was still far from the finished article. During the Persian Gulf War, the coalition was just heads and shoulders above Iraq. Take, for instance, the fact that Operation Desert Sabre lasted only 100 hours. Many Iraqi troopers even surrendered without engaging in battle, overwhelmed by the prolonged coalition air campaign and the rapid, powerful ground defense. Would you blame them, though? Many Iraqi troops were war-weary conscripts, forced to fight in a conflict they did not support, and trained primarily in static defense. While their arsenal included some modern Western, Chinese, and Soviet systems, it mostly comprised older Soviet models. In contrast, the all-volunteer forces of the United States and Britain were equipped with a range of advanced weaponry, and this allowed the US to basically get away with some of its flaws. While the Los Angeles-class submarines were notably capable of attack, as I've already highlighted, many were known to have limited depth when compared to some of their counterparts, such as the Russian Akula class. And how about its operational constraints? Similar to the USS Louisville, the Pittsburgh was relatively large, which again could limit its maneuverability in shallow or confined waters. Smaller, more agile submarines tend to do better in this niche, and that's why they often win in head-to-head battles tailored to this context. Don't even get me started about the noise levels. Compared to the other classes that came after it, you'd be hard-pressed to say the Los Angeles class's noise levels wouldn't make it more detectable. But that's not to say Pittsburgh itself wasn't worth appraising. Its improved hull shape and sound dampening techniques reduced its acoustic signature by a wide margin. This made the Pittsburgh harder to detect, while also being better at avoiding enemy anti-submarine warfare systems and maintaining the element of surprise in operations, compared to most of the submarines in its class. Finally, Pittsburgh's armor was by no means a slouch, with 21-inch bow torpedo tubes capable of launching Mk-48 ADCAP torpedoes, Tomahawk land attack missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and mine-laying capabilities. The Pittsburgh had insane versatility. Retrospectively speaking, the Persian Gulf War was a huge success for the coalition from a statistical perspective. While official figures for the Iraqi military operation are largely non-existent, the number of Iraqi military casualties ranges from 8,000 to 50,000. In contrast, Allied deaths were relatively low. During Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, only 147 US personnel and 47 British troops were killed in action, with about 1,000 coalition troops estimated to be wounded. But don't take this to mean it all went as planned. The aftermath of the Gulf War was a fragile piece, painted with sanctions, tensions, and the lingering smell of future conflict. The volatile environment in its wake set the stage for more battles to come, including the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which led to even more turmoil and devastation. But hey, if you want to know all about it and more, then this is easily the right place to be. It was a lot of fun making this video, but sadly, all good things come to an end. Or do they? Be sure to check out the channel for other amazing videos like this. And make sure you smash that like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when a new video is released.